Hi everyone, welcome to What's Going On, a podcast series where we have important, relevant, and sometimes difficult conversations to inspire you to start having your own. In today's episode, we are talking feminism and the patriarchy in honor of Women's History Month in March. We cannot talk about the fight for women's rights without highlighting the disparities between women of intersectional identities, especially Indigenous women. According to the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women, Indigenous women are murdered at 10 times more than the average national murder rate. What's Going On is by Suffolk University's Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion in Boston, Massachusetts. Hence, we would like to honor the Mashpee Wampanoag, Akina Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts tribal nation whom this land originally belonged. It is imperative to acknowledge the Massachusetts tribe who historically lived in areas that make up present-day Greater Boston. We honor the diverse tribes, people, and respect their connection to this land. To know more about the land you are on and ways you can support the Indigenous community, please visit www.native-land.ca. And for those of us in Massachusetts, maindigenousagenda.org. You can also find out more about the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people at mmihwhoismissing.org. Let us jump right into the episode with Emily Weltman, a social entrepreneur and intersectional feminist who aims to achieve gender parity and inclusion one business at a time. Hi, Emily.
Hello.
Would you like to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Well, hi. It's so nice to see you. Really happy to be on today. You invited me on. We met through LinkedIn. I think you found me through some of my posts. And it's funny that I sort of fell into this network of DEI experts and people that kind of do that as a career, because that's not my career. But I say and like I was just telling you, I watched this video this morning of Brittany Packnett talking about intersectionality, just as a to kind of hype myself up for our talk. And I really like a lot of what she says. I watch her all the time. And she talked about just that it should be in everything you do. So it's not just an HR function. That's what it was. I didn't lose my train of thought. So she was like, you need to make sure that DI doesn't just fall on to the woman of color or to Black women, Asian women, that it's something that you do in every area of your business. And that's definitely what I do. So that is, I think, how I found ended up like connecting more and more with DEI, like community, the DEI community on LinkedIn, was because when I started my business, I was like, this is like social justice, racial justice, gender equity has to be infused in every single part of a business. And I worked in corporate America for a really long time, and I've been a woman all my life, and I have experienced my fair of sexism and things like that. I'm Jewish. I've experienced anti-Semitism, and so I know the importance of building better work cultures, and like how I feel like it's kind of one of the most important things, because it really makes the difference between people thriving or not and being psychologically safe or not in a work space. And you spend all your day at work, so it becomes a lot of who you are, especially in this country. So so that's so I have my own consultancy now that I've had for a couple of years, working with entrepreneurs. But part of what I do is just kind of build this stuff in from the beginning. And I work a lot with marginalized founders from marginalized communities, and they're usually relatively familiar with all this stuff. But then if I work with founders that aren't, then I sort of just kind of like start to seed education a little bit here and there.
So you mentioned about being in the corporate world and how that spurred you to be more interested in DI and uplifting people from communities of color. And one of the big topics we're talking about today is feminism and white feminism. So would you want to educate the audience a little bit about firstly priming us with an introduction of what feminism is, and how did that take on a bad rep that we kind of know now?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll say, since we're going to talk about feminism and intersectional feminism, um, before we go too deep into that, I wanted to check in with you because part of being an intersectional feminist is making sure that you're acknowledging all of the different pieces of humanity that somebody comes into the room with, right? And there's a lot of really terrible things happening in the news right now, with violence against Asian Americans, and then not being talked about, right? So there's like two problems with it. One is it's happening at all, and two, the media isn't really reporting on it a lot. And you were really, great with me when we communicated that, yeah, you were having like some struggles with it like last week, as well everyone experiencing that should. So I just wanted to check in with you about that before I answer like deeper on, my definition of feminism and stuff like that.
Yeah, I appreciate you checking in. I feel that last week was a moment in time in that way that I feel that there's a lot of moving parts to the issue of anti-Asian hate crimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had an episode before this talking about the model minority myth and how Asians are often overlooked in this line of advocacy and equity work, that people think that Asians in that way, quote, have it good, unquote,
Mm-hmm.
that we earn a lot more than other communities of color, other people of color. And that may be true in spaces like tech space. At the same time, the Asian diaspora is large, right? There's so-called East Asians, which are more like Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, and then there's South Asians, which are like Indians. And I think people always think that we are monolith, that we are one and the same. I get a lot of people who would say that, oh, you all look the same, referring to us as Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, that we all look the
Mm-hmm.
same. And how that links to feminism and my identity as an Asian woman is that it's two-pronged, which I'm pretty sure you'll talk about later, that
Yeah.
as an Asian, there's this need to bring solidarity with other communities of color, and kind of explaining why that is necessary, that model minority myth has us pitting against one another and have you thinking that I'm better than you, and that's not the case. And the
Right.
bigger enemy is white supremacy. And me as a woman, that there is still misogyny within the work of advocacy and calling for solidarity. There's still Asian men who think that patriarchy is held only by white men and
Mm-hmm.
that they're not responsible for the patriarchy, when in fact, I will speak from my culture. Chinese has thousands of years of culture, and what's embedded in that culture is that men have a higher social status than women
Mm-hmm.
just by being a man.
Mm-hmm.
And for us to be activating in that way and advocating for ourselves as Asian women or Asian non-men, to include non-binary folks,
Mm-hmm.
agender folks, is that we have to come to this reckoning that it's not just the Asian community having to stand for ourselves and speak for ourselves, that we are diaspora, we are not a monolith, but also for Asians who are not men to talk to our men that, look, this is not just about race. Intersectionality also has us talking about gender, and we need
Mm-hmm.
you to acknowledge that. So that has been kind of what I have come to realize the past 10 days. It doesn't mean that I've only started thinking about it the past 10 days, but
Of course not. Yeah.
because, of like it's like a wave, right? Because of what has happened, it built up to the point of like, having to name it, having to kind of like put
Mm-hmm.
verbalize what is going on and what we need to work on. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you checking in, and that's basically what I really want to share with the audiences.
Yeah, that's great. I think that you described that so well. It really is like a wave. When I think, and I can only imagine, as a woman of color, and especially I think for Black women in this country, that wave is almost never ending, right? But I have for what I experience, like when there is something in the news, like the Kavanaugh hearings, that wave hit me terribly, right? When, something like the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting happened, like that wave hit me. And like, you do kind of like, whatever hits you from your intersectional point of view, and it really is like, you have to kind of go through like, a grief basically, and sort of figure out how you feel about the whole thing and where you are and how you want to communicate that to other people. And I definitely felt that even with what was happening with Trump and when he was like talking about the Proud Boys, and I live in Oregon, so I was extra sensitive to it. But just naming that like, that anti-Semitism is still a thing. And I definitely had, we can talk about that later, but I've definitely seen posts where the same thing happens to anti-Semitism. It just gets brushed under the rug. It's not a thing anymore. It's, and yet I know, and I'll talk about this when I give you my definitions finally, but that like I have a lot of privilege in America as a white woman, and that I can take off for now most of my otherness, if you will. Can't take off being a woman most of the time, but that does give me upward mobility that doesn't happen if you are a woman of color. So feminism, so it's interesting to me. I mean, I think feminism, we talked about this right away. I think that's part of the reason that you had asked me on, and I was like, well, if we're talking about intersectionality, do you want just me? Like that, I'm not the most intersectional person. But you had a great point that you wanted to talk about it from like a white feminism perspective. So, my feeling is, as I've ridden these waves and had to learn what I feel, and what I believe, is that, feminism gets a bad rap. And that's because there's different waves of feminism. Actually, funny to use the wave term, because there really are, first, second, third wave of feminism that did not do everybody equal justice, right? It was very self-serving. It was this idea that we all want equality, but it was really for white women. And so I think today, when you say that you're a feminist, immediately it's taken as a negative. And I think of like, my kids are so progressive that like I love it, but sometimes they challenge me. And so my daughter, who's 11, will say, well, Mom, feminism, it's not about it's girls' turn to rule the world. Because my son, who's like loves me and he's littler, he's like, Mom, it's girls' turn to rule the world. He drew like a picture of me, as like a superhero kind of thing. And my daughter's like, no, it's everybody's turn to rule equally. And I like love that she kind of gets that, like, when you're a feminist, it's not about like women are better, right? I do struggle with that a little bit, because we have a lot of ground to make up. And I do feel like it is our turn in some sense, that like we need to be given or take our seats at the table, right? Make our own tables. But that's Shirley Chisholm's a Black woman, so I don't want to say that, but like if we need to make our, pull up our own chair or make our own table, we will. But I do think that there is something to remember in that like feminists aren't man haters. I think, you use the word in our notes, like, oh, we'll talk about misandry. And I was like, I didn't even really honestly know that word very much. It doesn't get used as much as misogyny, surprisingly. I mean, I knew of it, but I was like, of course misogyny gets used more, because we're the ones talking about it, and we're talking about this stuff. So I think it gets a bad rap, which is unfortunate, because I think everybody should be a feminist. Doesn't matter who you are, because the idea of feminism to me is not about women being more, it's about everybody being equal, right? And that we all deserve an equal chance. And honestly, to me, when you're an intersectional feminist, it's kind of like, it's a great term, but to me, I take it as like, everybody, no matter what your intersection is, should be equal, right? We should be fighting for equality, not based on the way you look. You even said, I'm speaking in the binary, and I shouldn't be, right? Like, it's not just men and women. Like, I watched a great, do you ever watch Blair Imani on Instagram? She's like 60 second, right? She did a really good one that was like, I think it was 9 minutes, of LGBTQ IA2S plus, and she explained each one. So for your viewers, it's pretty good. And so that's another thing, is like the intersection of how you identify is super important. So as far as that was your first question, was your second question about intersectionality, how I define that, or did I make that up?
Not yet. It's just basically
Okay.
like the basis of feminism and how they evolve. And so you
Oh,
mentioned
yeah.
wave, right? Waves of feminism. So
Yes.
would you want to give an overview, like a crash course for our audience about what the different
Uh,
waves are?
yes, I will do my best, as a gender expert, so to speak. I mean, I'm only an expert in that I want equality for everyone, but you know, social justice and gender and racial justice is like a part of what I do, but it's not what I do. So like, as I said, like I'm not a DI expert. So you probably could do a better job than I will, but I will definitely, so please correct me. But what I really focus on is the difference between second wave feminism and now. So I think of like first wave feminism as the suffragists, right? And like women trying to gain for the first time in the public sphere some kind of equality, right? I wrote a paper on this, which I'll also share with you, called something about politics persisting in patriarchy. And it basically was like the last 100 years of women, and how what white women kind of owe Black women in this country for their, for this movement, for basically learning how to fight for your rights, because Black women sort of taught us how to do that. And so, when they fought for suffrage in first wave feminism, Black women fought for it knowing that they weren't going to benefit. They knew that white women would get it, and they just knew it was moving the movement forward. So to me, that is a huge part of like good example of intersectionality. It's like we're fighting for everybody. Second wave feminism, when I think of it, again, like it's a lot more complex than this. I'm just telling you how I bucket it so that I can compare it from like one movement to the next. Is that, second wave feminism is like the 60s, burning bras, beginning of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like women have power and we don't need to behave like men, coming out of the kitchen, all of those things. Second wave feminists, most of them are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 60s and 70s, I would say. Oh, well, I guess no, 80s, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have been one too. So they often miss intersectionality because, especially as white women, they were sort of just like plowing ahead and they weren't looking behind. And so I have a friend of mine who taught me like from activism, like a great thing that, if you're marching, you don't leave anybody behind. She's like, you can always tell the people that are new to a Black Lives Matter protest because they're running across the bridge and there's somebody with a disability there and they're not helping them from behind, right? To make sure that we're all moving forward together. And I think second wave feminisms didn't really do a great job of that, right? Like white women were like, it was all about gender equality, and they really, they missed a lot, right? And so I think, now the third wave feminism, 80s-ish, and then I kind of think that this is a fourth wave. I don't know if that's really like, there's some people defining that and some people talking about that. Some people say there's only three waves, but I think that the idea that, we're learning from the good and the bad that second wave feminists did, right? How great they were at breaking these barriers and changing laws and rules for women and norms and expectations, right? And you think like they were wearing jeans and like, just like there's all these things that, as we evolved, just even with our clothing. And I was an apparel designer, so I can't help myself there. But I think that like, in being in spaces now where I see second wave feminists running programs or teaching classes and things like that, they unknowingly cause a lot of harm for women of color because they just talk about gender in such an outdated way. They haven't really had this education. So there's a perspective, well, but I was in the 60s and it was the civil rights and I know it. And you're like, yeah, I think I know stuff too, but I actually don't, right? Like it's just learning it in a different way. So I think that now, the movement that we're in now, if you identify as a feminism, it's intersectionality or you're not a feminist. Like if you don't do that, because otherwise you're not fighting for everybody. You're just fighting for white women. And that's really not, first of all, it's not beneficial to white women to do that. You need to fight for everybody. But also it's not authentic to me.
Yeah, I agree. You definitely have to encompass all of it. It's almost like doing social justice work as well. You may specialize in designing workshops and policies around equity for race-based identities, but you cannot not care about LGBTQ plus. You cannot not care about
Right.
accessibility. So it's kind of like
Right.
parallel there with feminism. And I like that you mentioned about learning from the second wave because there's good and bad. And I think a lot of times people think of social justice or think of ourselves as like good or bad. Like you're either a racist or you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's it's time for a lot of us to kind of reconcile with the fact that we can be activists or we can think of ourselves as not activists, but our actions have consequences and our actions affect
Yes.
people in different ways. And so I don't think anyone would like to be labeled as racist. I don't think anyone wants to be racist. However,
Sexist.
so,
I can
yeah,
tell you
or
right now,
sex.
my partner is not thrilled when I'm like, oh, you're like, that's so patriarchal, but
That's right.
sorry, go ahead, finish what you're saying. Sorry.
No, sorry. I was just gonna say that because I face people getting defensive when I say that, hey, what you said hurt me, or I'm not comfortable with you expressing that view when I'm around, especially for example around politics. And they are like, but I'm not racist. Why are you saying all this? And I'm like, I'm not saying that you're racist. I'm saying that you're
Mhm.
complicit towards this current system that's
Right.
oppressing people like me.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I also think like, we can get into a little bit more about like white fragility and things like that. But I think that just in general, as Americans, we're like very like label sensitive. So on the one hand, we want people to very much identify us correctly. And if you don't, you're the worst, which can be challenging, because if you have people new in this space and they misgender you, but they mean well, some people will say, well, that's not good enough. You can't mean well, you have to get it right. Okay,
Right.
well, I want it. I want a little bit more bandwidth there because I want to bring more people along personally. And so, I have a coach that's non-binary, and once in a blue moon, I slip and use the wrong pronouns, and they're super gracious about it. And we've talked about it, and I've said like, I don't want to do that. I want to make sure I get it right every time. And my kids correct me all the time. But again, like that's something new. I have to unlearn that there is other genders, right? Like I spent 40 plus years in this world. Or well, hopefully I learned about that a little earlier. But I think, so on the one hand, labels are super important to us, right? We want people to label us well. On the other hand, we're like, don't call us anything, right? So that's why I think even women that are advocates for gender equality are like, I'm not a feminist. I don't like that, because they think, okay, well, I'm a second wave feminist, or they identify with something negative. And I think the thing that changed my mind so much about this was Ibram Kennedy's book. And I know it's super like cheesy, everybody reads him and refers to him, but I was reading the beginning of his book, and I did the audio book. He's speaking it, and I was like, he's describing himself, a teenage, young Black kid, and he's like, and I was so racist, and I was like, wait, what? Like,
Okay.
and then
Yeah.
he explains about how everybody's racist unless you're not being racist, like unless you're actively trying to be anti-racist, because our default is racism. And I just think that's so true. Our default is misogyny. Often our default is definitely sexism and patriarchy. I mean, women have not had that. Then our generation was not taught to treat women equally. It was taught to subjugate women. And so I don't think it's so bad when people are like, because the other thing too is like, being and or acting like something is not it. So if I say like, God, you're being a brat, like that's not nice. But if I'm saying you're being bratty, it's a little different. Now, some people don't parse those apart. My kid would be like, I don't want you to say that either. But for me, I'm like, if you're saying that what I'm saying is racist, I don't want to be sensitive about that. If you call me a racist, that's a little bit different. But I should still not take that personally, because in theory, by even Kennedy's definition, which I really like, we're all racist. It's just important to, especially if you are a person who wants, if you're new to this, right? And you're a person who wants to be better about inclusivity and using proper terms and calling people by what they want, identifying people and being sensitive, you have to be willing to be corrected. And you have to not be so sensitive, especially white women. Honestly, I saw a post the other day. Somebody said, when white women get to a point where they are like, what did they say? It was like not grateful, but even more so like excited when they get corrected, like almost like they're like in it for real. That's when that's good, but it's very rare. And I'm like, oh, I'm at that point now where if I get corrected, it still hurts. I still get embarrassed. I still feel weird a little bit. I get over it faster. But I am so grateful that somebody called me out, whether they called me out in public or in private. Because otherwise, how else do you learn or know? If you've been raised in a homogenous society your whole life, how would I know? Like I'm sure I say stuff all the time that's not okay. But what you said earlier, it's like intent versus impact, is a big thing that we talk about in this space. It's like, well, I might have meant well, but if I misgendered somebody and it really bothered them, the impact might be really hurtful. And I need to acknowledge that. On the one hand, I would like grace because I'm trying to learn. On the other hand, they don't owe me grace because that's who they are. And if somebody called me something I wasn't, and I didn't like it, I have every right to feel that way, right? So I think owning that and owning those mistakes and acknowledging that, like, yeah, we're quote unquote learning, but like nobody has to be patient with our learning. That's another huge thing for me. It's like that, it's the idea of like a journey. Like that sounds so like peaceful and like you have all the time in the world, and I don't have time. I'm like, there's no time. We got to fix this now.
I agree. And I also want to mention how, because you mentioned about learning, right? And journey. And it's a lifelong journey to unlearn what we are brought up with, believing,
Sure.
and also relearning. And part of that is decentering oneself, learning how to decenter and say that this is not about how I feel, or this is not about me. This is about that person being hurt and them taking the effort to tell me. And so I should center their feelings and what they're saying instead of me. Because I think it's very funny the more I think about it now. And something that I don't really realize is that you ever get those moments where you tell someone that you're hurt and then they get mad that you're mad?
Every single day in my house.
And isn't that so weird that
it is, but it's a defense thing. It's like
right.
They're hurt, but they'd rather deflect, right? Like that's, they see you're hurt, and a lot of times it's people can't handle your feelings. So we have a saying in my house that our pediatrician uses and is like, all feelings are welcome here. Like it's okay for a woman to be real pissed and real angry and yelling. All feelings are welcome. It's okay for my son to cry his eyes out, like there, and I think that, like, especially for us, the adults in the house, like that's hard to remember sometimes, that, you just want to be like, stop,
That's right.
Yeah.
And we have to remember that is also the harm of patriarchy. We always think that patriarchy only hurts women, but it hurts men too, because it's telling men that some emotions are not okay for them to express. Some behaviors are not okay. You cannot wear a skirt, whatever that means,
Right.
and you cannot cry. You cannot show vulnerability. And so bring that out as well. And you were talking about waves of feminism and white feminism, how now people cannot be feminist and not intersectional. So
Mm-hmm.
let's talk a little bit about TERFs. So for those who
Okay.
have not heard of the term, TERFs is TERF. It's an
Mm-hmm.
acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. So they are
Right.
basically people who claim to be feminists, but are also fighting against trans women,
Mm-hmm.
especially trans women of color, Black trans women, um, gatekeeping and preventing them from entering spaces for women. So, what are your thoughts
Mm-hmm.
about that?
Yeah.
And share with us.
Yeah. And I think, it sort of kind of goes to, well, I just want to go back to what you were talking about earlier. You said something about centering, right? Or decentering yourself. So I think that is a lifelong practice for everyone, right? Well, not everyone, a lot of people are raised in a culture where they don't center themselves. But for white women, for sure, part of second wave feminism was like speak up, get loud, own the room, take up space, right? Because men wouldn't let us. So we were like thrown in the room. And now it's like you've got to hang back. And even so that can be hard. And it's hard for me. I'm a talker. Like my culture, I'm a New York Jew. We talk over each other. Like that's, and when I moved out to Oregon, I didn't realize the impact of that on my culture here until I moved here, and I have had severe culture shock. It was just like, what? Everybody thought I was so rude and pushy. And then I just realized, oh, it's literally just that part of me. So I think the decentering is really important. And to tie it into TERFs, if you're being truly intersectional, you accept everybody for their identity, however they want to show up. I think that the idea to exclude anybody, to me, it's like so counterintuitive. And it seems to me that it stems from, I don't know enough about why, but to me it stems from some a little bit religious, right? Like that there's this idea of like, yes, but God created, right? Like, so yes, we should be equal, but then God created this binary. Which I think that shows up a lot. I think I honestly don't think you can talk about what happens in America in intersectionality, in feminism, in gender, race, religion, without talking about religion and the fact that we're not just talking about a patriarchy, we're talking about a Christian patriarchy, right? Like that has had a huge influence on our government. I mean, all our laws, our constitution, everything was written with this idea of quote unquote religious freedom, but really it's religious freedom for white men, right? It's freedom for white men. So I say in that article I talked about, like, we are a footnote. Everybody except for white men, Christian men, we're a footnote in our government, right? And so the country, like, you feel that. And I think so for TERFs, like it doesn't compute to me at all. Like I don't, so the only way that I can sort of explain that for myself is to be like, well, that must be like a religious belief. But for me, again, it's the idea of you don't leave anybody behind physically, like literally pull everybody up, put people in front, right, that have been behind, learn to take up less space or go back if you have some power and privileges. Like, that thing I listened to this morning, like Brittany says, like, you pay with your privilege. Like, we don't want your guilt, use your privilege. And I love that. It's like, use your privilege as currency. And that's what I've been doing. That's what I definitely want to be doing. And I think that's so important. So for people, you said at the beginning about, I'm not sure if this was our pre or not, but like, it causes, like, we're not helping each other when we don't accept each other's oppression, right? Like that you are like the model minority, and therefore like it's not acknowledged, and and I feel like if it's a problem within communities, they like the white supremacy wants us infighting. It's really beneficial for them to keep us separate. And so it's really helpful to white supremacy if you do not support trans people. If you're a TERF and you say, yeah, I want equality. If you're a Black Lives Matter person, but you don't support trans people. And so that they want us all fighting because it just keeps them in power. So I think it's so important that we don't do that, and that we, make sure that weren't being inclusionary. But I think, again, that has to do with, where people's lines are. Is like, if you have a line, like, well, that's as far as I can go as far as inclusion, well, if you have a line, and if it's religious, then you're not really including everybody, and it's detrimental to the fight for equality for everybody, including the people that are fighting. Please correct me if I miss anything, because I know that you are an expert in this field much more than I am, and you're being nice because I'm your guest yapping away, but please correct me.
No. Okay, first off, for the record too, my belief is that there are no experts in DEI. And I think that's the beauty as well, that we are all work in progress. I make mistakes. And also at the same time, because of my identities, I'm never an expert of anything in social justice. It's a collaborative effort, and it's a learning experience, as much as it's a career, and as much as it's a commitment, and as much as a passion. But I appreciate your sentiment. And you were talking about including people as part of intersectionality, and talking about how identifying as a white woman, there are some spaces that you're gonna be wary of. And also, I like the mentality of privilege being a currency. Pay with your privilege and not with your guilt. And that reminds me
Brittany Packnett. She's great.
Yeah, we need to link that for the audience in the description boxes below. And that brings me to the point also of Kamala Harris, right? When she became vice president, or rather before she became vice president, during the debate, she tries to take up the space that she deserves. And I see a lot of white women on LinkedIn be like, yes, women power. And at the same time, it's like, hang on. I think we need to remember that she's also a Black woman, and how that is relevant is that I wish that more white women, when they say that they acknowledge her Blackness.
Oh, absolutely. I find that weird. I think after how long I've been sort of ingrained, but I would say it really is in even the last 2 years that I've gotten better at that. So like you said, it's a learning, right? I knew about intersectionality and was definitely intersectional in my brain when I started my business. And I've definitely been, I would say probably for like 5 years, very aware of, bringing up race when I talk about gender. But it's definitely in the last 2 years where I'm like, and Black women, at every time I'm like, yeah, white women have it hard and Black women have it worse. And it's hard because, not hard. Character counts are a real thing, right? When you're talking on LinkedIn or where we met, right? And you even said that to me, you're like, I had to cut that for character count, right? And Instagram, all of that. And you want to make a point, and you want to make a lot of points. There's a tendency to reduce people to an acronym, right? Like LGBTQ, BIPOC. In England, they have BAME. I don't know if you say it BAME or if it's just BAME, but do you know?
Yes, I've heard, but I don't know how to. I like LinkedIn, right? I read it, but I don't really know. I have not heard of people saying that in real life.
Yeah, I think it's BAME. And then there's ADOS or ADOS, which is American Descendants of Slavery, right? So there's a tendency to use those. And a lot of what's happened this year is people don't want that, right? And that's totally valid. You don't have to be a letter, right? We don't have a letter for white. It's just we're the default, right? And so, which is terrible. So, and yet I sometimes, I want to use those because I want to include all those people, and I can't fit 10 people in this thing. And also, when you're writing, because I'm a writer, it's a mouthful to say it all the time. But that's not an excuse. That's just my discomfort, because saying white woman or white Jewish woman isn't a mouthful to me. It might be to somebody else, right? So you have to respect people's identities as they want to be. And so I think with Kamala, you want to always acknowledge that. And it's very interesting to see, there's definitely more white women that are getting it than aren't, when you see things like what happened in Georgia with, oh my God, Stacey Abrams. There we go. So I'm getting old. It takes like a minute to recall things sometimes. You know, where women were like, you know, oh yeah, Democrats, like we did it and and you're like, no, like that's Black women's hard work, right? And so I think it's really important to just acknowledge that, and it's really actually quite easy to do that. I think what I noticed, it's interesting that you were like saying how she took up space. I'm like, I noticed that she was totally code switching. Like, and you know, I don't know what her default is at home. She's married to a white Jewish guy, you know, and he has two white kids, who I think do not identify as Jewish. But like, you know, she's part of the reason that she's, and I hate this word, but like palatable in this country is because she is good at being in these spaces and being acceptable, like not making people uncomfortable, right? Like, you know, as I think, you know, like some of the friends that I know is like, well, like they don't bring out their real Black, you know, like that happens when we're not around. You know, I don't know what that is for her. I have no idea what she's like when she's, you know, her facade is off. But I know that from what I observed in the debates, like she's powerful and she did a great job. But I think that she also is definitely like having to put on this, you know, what's acceptable in white culture. And the same thing, you know, I'll say for you know, like Bernie and Warren. I mean, Warren was like this, you know, and what's her name? Hillary Clinton was like, you know, this like pushy, like the nagging, like, you know, just all these negative things that were said because they were being forceful in their way, right? And then, you know, Bernie, because he was like this really pushy, he's a Jewish guy. He's gonna be like this whiny, pushy person. That's his personality. That really is like a cultural thing. You know, Cory Booker and you know, I think a lot of, you know, the other people that ran of color, like they have to code switch all the time. And I think that that is something to acknowledge, that's got to be exhausting, right? Like I know when I've tried to be a quieter person, right, and try to like temper myself for the patriarchy, I don't like doing it. So I think that like it's so important to acknowledge that part of their identity, because then when you do that, you're also acknowledging the work that they have to do to live that identity in a white supremacist country, right, in the government. And so yeah, I mean, I think like she's amazing and I think we should celebrate it. And it's interesting because I also saw Black women that said they didn't want to celebrate her because of the harm that she caused to Black communities, from her like legal, you know, work in California and in the contributing to prison pipeline. And I think that like what you were saying is like it can both be true, right? But we're moving the needle a little bit every day, and yeah, we can acknowledge that's really bad, and we can still acknowledge it. This is me. Not everybody has to agree, right? If I'm a Black woman, you're entitled to say like, look, she did more harm than good. For me, she is in the White House now, and we haven't had a she in the White House, and that's rad. And I want to celebrate that, and I want to celebrate how hard she worked for that. But I understand completely, you know, if people don't want to do that.
The reason why I brought up Kamala Harris' point is also because I think it's all right to identify with any woman, but it's also a responsibility to acknowledge that, especially if the woman has an identity that that person do not share, to acknowledge that. You know,
Yeah.
it's not oppression Olympics. It's not about, you know, who is oppressed
Mm-hmm.
more than the other. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what so-called white feminists have a difficulty understanding.
Mm-hmm.
It's that, again, intersectionality, right? You can't look at a person and be like, she's a woman, I'm a woman, so we're the same. Like, we are not the same. And
Right.
it's important to acknowledge that. And you were talking about near the start about Black women, acknowledging Black women in the movement for suffrage. So can you talk more about that? Because I personally didn't know about the history either.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm basically, there was a huge amount of support from women, in the turn of the century, that they helped, march. They stood next to white women and fought. They, when they were granted the right to vote, Black women were too. And actually, a lot of people don't know this, a lot of Black women did vote at that point. And what happened was, so because we have state to state laws, they being the white supremacist patriarchy was like, well, we're gonna, every state put laws down that make it so that it's harder for them, right? So like they had taxes, like a poll tax, so they had to pay. They had to have a reading test, right? And so that, that it was like these things to like disenfranchise poor people, people of color. And so one of the things they did was there was a bunch of women that got together and made a school, and they taught them all to read, and like 1,000 of them, and they, Black women, so that they could pass the test and vote, and they did. But what happened was the same thing that happened when, Black men were freed slaves and they could vote. There was lynching, there was total intimidation at the polls, like violence and all of that. And so over time, they just couldn't do it. Like they couldn't actually have access. But for a few years, they did do that. But the thing was, I think there's a sentiment, which I concur with based on the history, is like, white women got the right to vote and they just were like, cool, see you later. Like they could have easily stood next to these women, not easily, would have been work, right? But stood next to these women and fought for them, right? But they didn't show up for them at all. And I think that that's the thing that makes, now hard, is like over time, we've not shown up, right? There's a lot of distrust. There's a lot of, and rightfully so, white women kind of keep letting them down, right? Like letting all women of color down, not just Black women, but especially Black women. And, at the end of the day, like I'm still me, I can still just go about my life. Like that's what in the suffragist movement, same thing. Like you can just say that journey was fun and I don't need to learn about this anymore. It's like, that's why I hate the word journey, because I'm like, who has time for a journey? Only white people have time for a journey. Other people are dying, literally getting abused, like Asian Americans last week. Like it's not, I'm like, you're learning, or as you said, I think even more, you're unlearning, right? It takes a lifetime to unlearn. I think that that's true of all the behavior we want to change. Like all of us who don't want to necessarily punish like our parents. Like my parents were spanked, but I didn't get spanked, I think, that much. Maybe I got once, and like I don't do it at all. But you have to unlearn that. So I think unlearning all of this takes time. There was something else I wanted to touch on before we ended about centering, which was that I think that there's something that I struggle with personally. And I when we first started talking at the beginning, like you were talking about your experience, and I immediately equated it to like my identity. I think that our culture, we're used to comparing, right? Like, oh, I have this, you have this. Like we just make comparisons a lot. And so our default is to try to like understand from our identity so that we can relate. But the idea that I did not coin this term, but there's like Jen McCabe, who is, so I work with this person, my coach, Nick, who is like, I say unparenting me, right? But is also, we talk a lot about gender and race and intersectionality because it's so part of who you are as a parent, right? And Jennifer McCabe, who is one of her like people that or one of their people that they love, see, I got their pronouns wrong, says that like it's radical relating. Like you have to learn to relate differently, and that you don't have to relate by comparison. And yet there is some sense of like, that's my identity and I can understand you, but not to decenter. And I think that what happens is when you bring up your own identity on top of somebody talking about their thing, they're like, that's cool. I don't want to hear that right now. Like you said, you're mad at me and now, like I was mad at you and now you're mad at me. Like that hurt me. And now, and my kids do that. Like if they're upset about something, they say, oh yeah, when I was a kid, they don't want to hear that. They don't care. They want me to center them. And when you do that well, it's not natural for us, but when you do it well for kids, it's great. It literally snaps people out of that pain in a way because they feel seen. And when you push against it or you compare it to your own experience and not just accept it as their pain, that is when I think the struggle continues. So I always say it like this. My son, when he was little, if his string cheese got broken, I could like argue with him all day long that you can get another one, whatever, it doesn't matter, it tastes the same, blah, blah, blah. And he'd scream for hours. But if I just said, I'm so sorry, that's really hard for you, and acknowledge that that's for him as a 4-year-old was like just as bad as if he lost, I don't know, a toy, a friend, I don't know. Because you can't know what people feel like. And that's another thing that Jennifer McCabe talks about is like our idea of empathy is a little bit wrong because you can never be in somebody else's shoes. I can never know what you feel. I just have to acknowledge what you feel is real for you and that hurt is real. And I think that the more white women can do that, to bring it full circle, the more white women can do that for other women and women of color, the better, right? And so, my default was like, well, but I'm a Jewish woman, but that's not the same thing, right? And even if I experience that, I can identify with what you're saying about waves or pain, but it's really important to say, but like your experience is unique and valid and just as important, if not more. And that is kind of where the decentering happens. But I think that where we get stuck is when our default is to compare and then people get mad. Don't talk about yourself. It's like, okay, yes, but I'm unlearning, right? So like, I will learn not to talk about myself ever, but also I'm a person and I want to share something about myself too, so that you can understand me. So I think that to your point about, Kamala, you just have to acknowledge it. There is that part of the identity, and that in itself is actually really helpful. It's validating that you notice, oh, guess what? She's not a white woman. She's probably dealt with a lot of stuff, right? And so I think you're right. Like that's a huge thing.
Yeah, validation goes a long way for making people feel seen. That's the first. And, like you said, closing out, looking forward, you mentioned it in our conversation previously before the podcast, of that we put children in boxes. They didn't come with labels or categories to put people in, and we are the ones, society are the ones, parents are the ones who give them those boxes to put people in. And so, as parents, anyone out there, whether you're a feminist or not, it's something worth thinking about what boxes are you giving your kids to put people in, to put themselves in. And also decentering ourselves when we are called in or called out. I think that's very essential in this lifelong learning and unlearning of our harmful behaviors towards others and also of ourselves. And so, closing out, any last words for our audience? Anything you would like them to know? Anything you would like them to take away?
I think you wrapped it up beautifully. It's a long process to unlearn, embracing being called in or called out and getting more comfortable with that. And honestly, one of the things I learned kind of early on from getting deeper in the work was like, if you don't talk about race with your friends that are of another race, then they're not really your friends. And that really like opened my eyes, even my colleagues and coworkers. So, getting uncomfortable and having those conversations, but not necessarily, you want to be sensitive that you don't want to put those conversations on people of color, right? Black women, if they don't want to talk about you, if they don't know you, they're not comfortable with you with racism, like you can't just bring it up out of the blue. But it is a thing that you can constantly try to learn more and say, hey, are you willing to talk to me about this? Because I have a question and it's maybe really stupid. And you know what? You're not going to get it right. Like, that's, as a white woman, you're not going to get it right. But like, how many times do we not get anything right? Like, especially as parents too. So I would just say, part of the unlearning too is just like, and you touched on this right at the end, was like questioning your past. I think a lot of the reason that people don't do this work, this is my guess, right? Is that it's painful, right? I look back and I was a horrible person. I did horrible things. We can all probably say that in our lives. We've done things we regret, right? But when you're a white person growing up with privilege, and then you look back and you're like, oh God, I acted like that when I was in my 20s, like this Black woman I worked with. And I'm not going to go and find her and apologize. The only thing, that would put more junk on her. It's centering myself. It's my own problem. I just need to sit with that discomfort and then not do it again and learn how to pay it forward, right? How to pay that mistake forward in a better way. And so I think that like a lot of people, they get to a point with this and then it gets uncomfortable and they stop, because a lot of times you have to do a lot of, like, it's all self. It's not a lot of outside. It's a lot of looking at yourself and your assumptions and where your line is, like the turf line, right? Like my son, when he was little, teeny guy, he wore dresses. He had a sister, big sister. And we were like, great. It was super great. But like, when we would go out in public, it was kind of like, do you want to change? There was a line. Why? I don't know. But we would question that. Like, is that, where our discomfort would end, right? And so, are we the most progressive? Like, we're trying to be, but you're never going to be the most progressive. But I think that, like, really for white women especially, to do this work, all it is like literally unpacking how horrible have you been in the past? What did you assume? Not horrible, but right. What did you assume? And then don't stop. Like, great. So you remembered that. So, that was really not cool, right? Like, have you done that again since? Do you do that? The other day I was in the car with my daughter and I said something about a friend, and then later was like, that's probably like not okay to have that like stereotype about somebody. And my daughter was like, yeah, I would not say that again. And I was like, yeah, I'm definitely not saying that again. But you have to be aware and know that you're still going to mess up and you're going to say things and you're going to have these assumptions, but not let it stop you. So that's really, I just would say, don't let it stop you. Oh, I wore this shirt for just for today. We're not going back. So we're just moving forward. And I think, part of that is just like, keep asking yourself the questions and questioning what you know, because it may not be right.
Yes, I like that ending. It's so great. So thank you once again, Emily, for joining us. And thank you, audience who are listening in. Once again, this is What's Going On. There's a playlist on the right if you're on YouTube, and somewhere on the page if you're on Anchor. And I hope that you will join us next time for our next episode. Take care.
Thank you.
And stay safe. Thank you.